I had been planning the trip for months. A Mediterranean cruise, my first solo adventure in years, carefully organized down to the smallest detail. At 66, with 3 years of widowhood behind me, I finally felt ready to honor the dream Richard and I had always shared, but never lived. I had my new red suitcase packed, the tickets and insurance ready, and the taxi waiting outside with the engine running. But in my rush, I left my passport at home. That small oversight would change everything. When I stepped quietly through the back door, I only intended to dash upstairs, open the second drawer of my mahogany desk, and retrieve the document that would allow me a few days of escape. Emily and Kevin were visiting, as they did every Sunday, so I tried not to alert them. Emily would only worry, maybe even try to convince me to cancel the trip. She had become overprotective since Richard's death, insisting I wasn't strong enough to handle life alone. I tiptoed up the stairs, my heart racing more with anticipation of travel than exertion. But then I heard voices floating in from the garden, where they sat at the wrought iron patio set Richard had bought for our 20th anniversary. I froze near the lace curtains of my bedroom window. Their words carried with an awful clarity. "We can't wait any longer." Kevin's voice was firm, colder than I had ever heard it. "Your mother is very healthy for her age. She could live another 10 or 15 years. We can't wait that long." Emily sighed heavily, as though shedding years of hesitation. "I know, Kevin, but she's my mother. It scares me. Lately, I feel like I don't even recognize her anymore." "That's exactly why," he pressed. "She's making decisions on her own, like this ridiculous trip. What's next? Maybe she'll marry some old man from her book club? We can't let her squander our future on old age whims." Their words were knives. Our future? Old age whims? My hands trembled against the curtains. Kevin continued, his voice measured. "The lawyer says if we prove she's losing her faculties, we can get legal guardianship. Once we control her finances, we'll make the real decisions. This house alone is worth a fortune, and her savings would let us buy the condo we want." I prayed for Emily to object, to call this madness. Instead, she whispered, "You're right. I already spoke with Dr. Evans. He'll sign what we need. At her age, it's easy to argue cognitive decline. We'll use this sudden trip as evidence of erratic behavior." I nearly collapsed. My own daughter and her husband were conspiring to strip me of everything: my house, my savings, my independence, while I stood just above them, silent witness to their betrayal. The taxi honked outside, impatient, but I could no longer think of cruises or passports. Their voices went on, weaving the web of my downfall. "I also spoke to Susan," Emily confessed. "I told her I'm worried Mom repeats herself, forgets dates. If she notices anything odd, she'll believe it." "Excellent," Kevin said. "We'll use her as testimony. And talk to Mrs. Gable, too. She loves gossip. Once she starts, no one will doubt your mother is slipping." They were not only planning theft, they were destroying my reputation, sowing lies among my friends and neighbors. "Document everything," Kevin urged. "If she misplaces something, forgets a bill, wakes at night, write it down. It all adds up." My stomach churned. For months, perhaps years, they had been circling me like predators, waiting for signs of weakness. "And the house?" Emily asked. "Once we have guardianship, we sell it, say it's too big. Move her to a care facility. With her pension and what's left, she'll be comfortable enough. Or better yet, someplace private and far away. That way, we won't need to visit often. No neighbors around to question us." Then Emily laughed, a laugh I had never heard before, sharp and bitter. "The further away, the better. We'll live in peace." They even planned to begin ransacking while I was gone. "Next week, while she's on her trip, we can start going through her papers. Photograph jewelry, documents, valuables. Take small things first. By the time she notices, it'll be too late." The horn sounded again outside, but I could barely breathe. My only daughter, plotting with her husband to erase me from my own life. They thought me an obstacle, an old woman to be put away while they lived richly on my work and Richard's sacrifices. But as I clung to the wall for support, one thought burned brighter than despair. They had gravely underestimated me. I steadied my breath and chose not to confront them. Not yet. If they were going to turn my life into a case file, then I would build a case of my own. I pulled the passport from the second drawer, slipped out as quietly as I had come, and waved to the taxi with a smile that did not belong to my heart. On the ride to the airport, I asked the driver about the weather and traffic while my mind stitched a plan with the precision of a seamstress who refuses to waste thread. At the terminal, I called Susan from a payphone and asked, gently, if she had noticed anything strange about me. Her pause told me everything. Emily had visited her with stories of my confusion, of repeated anecdotes, of misplaced items. It was a pain that made my ribs feel too small for my lungs, but it was also a compass. I bought a small recorder at the gift shop and promised myself I would use it only to preserve the truth they were so eager to distort. The cruise was both balm and blade. Mornings were sunlight on water, and the quiet dignity of being a woman alone among couples who thought they understood love. Nights were a new kind of loneliness, the kind that looks like freedom in a mirror. I cried softly in my cabin, then sat up, wiped my face, and wrote lists. People to call, papers to secure, steps to take. I decided to return with a smile, not to reassure them, but to bait them. When I walked back into my house 5 days later, I praised the food, the scenery, the little markets. I watched their eyes for relief, for the small, greedy hope that I had not noticed anything amiss. But I had. Papers in a new order, a few pieces of jewelry gone, a faint dust line in the desk where a folder used to rest. I cooked dinner and told stories while I noted every glance they exchanged, every question about my accounts, every suggestion that perhaps the house was too much for me now. In the morning, I called Arthur, the lawyer who had known Richard since boyhood, and asked for a quiet review of my will. He listened the way good men listen, with patience and without surprise, and assured me that discretion was not a courtesy, but a duty. I began keeping my recorder in my pocket, capturing every patronizing suggestion about memory tests and safer living. I learned the difference between suspicion and proof, and I set about collecting the latter. One afternoon, I followed Kevin with a hat brim pulled low, hating the disguise, but hating more the fear that had once kept me from asking hard questions. I watched him meet a woman at a cafe across town, watched 2 small children call him daddy with the reverence of certainty, watched envelopes change hands, affection traded like receipts. I sat behind a newspaper and let the truth settle until it had the weight to hold its own. That evening, in my kitchen, I asked Emily gentle questions about nothing in particular, and my recorder listened harder than I did. She described new psychologists Dr. Evans could recommend, someone who could assess how I was coping. Coping is such an innocent word until you put it next to paperwork and signatures and a judge. I smiled and poured coffee with hands that did not shake. I thought about Richard's calm in hard seasons, how he used to say the first step toward justice is to stop shouting and start writing. I was done shouting inside my own skull. I was writing. I formed habits that looked like ordinary days. I watered the garden at 5 p.m. as always, and I dusted the shelves on Tuesdays and Fridays until the wood shone like good manners. I visited the bank to place alerts on my accounts and to flag any inquiries about transfers in case of incapacitation. I switched to a new safe deposit box and moved the most important papers there, keeping copies at home in folders that looked important but were not. Arthur helped me create a trust that could not be moved by any signature but my own. I booked a routine appointment with Dr. Evans and brought Susan along. I spoke clearly, remembered dates, asked detailed questions about my prescriptions, and requested all notes be uploaded to my patient portal. When he insisted on home check-ins, I thanked him and scheduled them at times when Susan could be present. I was polite the way a blade is polished, bright, reflective, and more dangerous for it. On Wednesdays, Kevin left work early. I learned that pattern the way you learn a lullaby, from repetition. I followed him again and watched him repeat the ritual: affection, envelopes, whispered timelines for a future that did not include my daughter's name. I photographed license plates and cafe receipts. Detective Miller came into my life then, recommended by Arthur as someone who believed that truth should not have to raise its voice to be heard. She sat at my table with a legal pad and steady eyes and said we would proceed carefully, not because we were afraid, but because we were right. Over the next weeks, my house became a quiet museum of evidence. I replaced certain items in my jewelry box with indistinguishable costume pieces and dusted the inside of drawers so that fingerprints would tell their story later. I updated the alarm system and added tiny cameras in frames and air vents, not because I wished to be a spy, but because I refused to be a victim. When Emily suggested selling the house, I asked her to explain the math of it, and she did, with a seriousness that broke something tender in me. I recorded her logic and kept my face soft. When Kevin asked to accompany me to the bank to simplify my payments, I said perhaps next week, and then I called Arthur and the bank manager and asked them to note that he was never to be added to anything, ever. For the first time since Richard's death, I slept through the night. It was not peace. It was purpose. And sometimes, purpose is stronger than peace. I wanted to scream at the kitchen ceiling, to wail the long mother's wail you hear at funerals. But I did not. Instead, I wrote the day's date on a new file folder. I labeled it with a single word: enough. The recorder captured conversations about misplacing blood pressure pills by accident, captured Kevin's suggestion that a few dizzy spells would make a stronger case. The cruelty pressed the air out of my chest, but I kept my face the shape of normal life. I began separating them, inviting Emily alone on Tuesdays, declining visits that included Kevin, widening the silence between them with questions I asked in different rooms. I wanted Emily to feel the edge of her own doubt. I wanted her to remember the girl who had signed her graduation cards with gratitude that looked like a promise. The day I confronted Emily alone, I used the good porcelain because I wanted her to understand that dignity would not be a casualty of this war. She sat where she had sat as a teenager while I folded laundry and asked about exams, except now the laundry was evidence and the exam was her soul. She spoke about specialists and grief and how decisions like my trip felt impulsive. Her hands trembled when I asked whether she had visited Susan to discuss my supposed lapses. I mentioned the bank, the inquiries about transferring funds if I became incapacitated, the copies of house keys I had never given. I named the pearl necklace that had gone missing, and I watched her face collapse inward, as if a roof beam had given way. She tried to call it concern. I called it by its name: betrayal made tidy with paperwork. When Kevin arrived uninvited, the temperature in the room shifted. The charm he had always worn like a pressed shirt fell away at the first hint of sunlight. I told him about the woman across town and the children who called him daddy, about the company that did not employ him because it had not existed for years. The truth stripped him to an angry core, and he showed me the man my daughter had married, the one I had suspected beneath the calculations. He called me names that would have made Richard step forward, but I did not need my husband's defense. I had my own. The doorbell rang, and the timing felt like a judge's gavel. Arthur stepped in with Detective Miller, who brought folders that did not shout but could not be ignored. Photographs, financial records, copies of forged inquiries, dates and times, the gentle arithmetic of wrongdoing that adds up to prison. Emily's face went through stages: confusion, denial, dawning comprehension, as if sunrise had been ordered to proceed slowly so she could feel every degree of light. I said little. I had spoken for weeks. Now evidence would do the rest. When Kevin sneered that concern for an elderly woman was not a crime, Miller laid the facts beside his words until the contrast did the speaking. Fraud, attempted theft, conspiracy. And then another knock. The kind of coincidence that belongs to stories but sometimes visits ordinary living rooms. The woman from the cafe stood in my doorway with eyes that had learned too much. Maria spoke quickly and with a steadiness that made me respect her immediately. She had thought Kevin divorced, had thought they would marry once finances improved, had believed the patient timelines of a liar who keeps two lives fed with borrowed truth. Emily's breath left her. The room made a sound like a heart tearing at the seam. I did not gloat. There is a flavor to vindication that turns bitter if you swallow too much of it. I told Maria who I was, and I told my daughter who she had really married. Miller continued as officers arrived to do the part of justice that involves handcuffs, and when Kevin shouted about conspiracies, the echo sounded small, a boy's protest in a room full of grown women who had finally gathered. The arrest was not dramatic because we had already lived through the drama. It was orderly, which felt stranger. The officers spoke calmly, read rights, and placed Kevin's wrists together as if returning stolen property to one place, the state's custody. Maria stood at the window with both hands on the sill, as if steadying herself against the sudden acceleration of truth. Emily sank into the sofa and shook, not the fragile tremor of performance, but an ancient shudder that belongs to people who realize they have been standing on a bridge that never reached the other side. I sat beside her without touching her. Love and boundaries can sit in the same chair, and that day they did. Miller listed the charges: bank fraud, forgery, conspiracy, attempted kidnapping by means of fabricated institutionalization. And I thought how language protects so much sorrow behind precise syllables. Arthur opened another folder to show me the documents where Kevin had sketched tunnels into my life. Proposed changes of beneficiaries, applications for loans against my house's value, quiet requests for additional cards, all of it blocked in time, but chilling in intention. I felt simultaneously furious and fortunate. There are moments when anger and gratitude share a cup, and you drink both. Maria apologized then, softly and fiercely, for taking money that did not belong to her without knowing its origin. She spoke of her children and the father-shaped story that would now have to be rewritten. I told her the truth that had kept me upright for weeks. She and I had been victims of the same expert manipulator. She lifted her chin the way resilient women do when new burdens star their skin with weight, and I admired her before I even knew we would become family of a kind. Emily asked for forgiveness in a voice that could not bear its own echo. I did not hand it to her like a spare key. I told her forgiveness would be a road, not a door, and that she would have to walk more of it than I would. She confessed to the incremental persuasion that had become her belief system. 100 small doubts seeded by Kevin, watered by their debts, pruned by his promises until she could not see the tree for the harvest. Miller nodded as if ticking boxes on a pattern she knew too well. I handed Emily a glass of water and did not say what she already knew, that I had raised her for courage and she had rented that courage out to a coward. When the house grew quiet after the police left, the air felt heavy, as if the walls were returning to their original positions after having been pushed out by deceit. Arthur and Miller stayed to outline next steps: freezing accounts linked to Kevin, securing my titles, filing formal statements. We discussed the cameras, the recordings, the paper trail. I kept seeing Richard standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, watching, steady as a clock that does not lose a minute. That night, I slept with the window open and left the recorder on my nightstand without turning it on. Some nights, the absence of vigilance is the only rest you can afford. 6 months gave the world time to adjust to the truth it had tried to ignore. Kevin's trial ended with a sentence of 12 years, the judge's voice even, the courtroom holding its breath because justice is not a spectacle, only a standard. Arthur called me the following week to say that most of what had been stolen had been recovered, with interest. He also arranged for a compensation fund for Maria and her children because the law, at its best, recognizes that sorrow is expensive. Susan and I sat at our favorite cafe on a bright afternoon and talked about ordinary things until silence asked for the extraordinary. She said I had been brave. I said I had been tired, and that sometimes tired women do remarkable things simply because they cannot bear the cost of doing nothing. Emily and I spoke rarely at first, then more often as her life began to right itself in small ways. She moved into a small apartment downtown and took extra shifts to dig herself out of the financial grave she had helped Kevin shovel. She went to therapy with a stubbornness I recognized as mine and learned to name the technique that had rearranged her instincts: gaslighting, financial coercion, incremental isolation. We did not rush our reconciliation. Forgiveness needs the slow heat of honesty, or it comes out raw. Maria found the biological father of her children with Miller's help, and the reunion was imperfect and beautiful the way real life is when it is not taking instructions from a liar. Her children kept calling me Grandma Clara, and the title fit in a way that did not steal from anyone. We set a table together sometimes, and grief and gratitude shared plates without argument. The community changed how it looked at me. I was no longer the widow they worried over, but the woman who had known when to switch from hope to strategy. It is a strange promotion, but I accepted it because it kept other women safer. I traveled again. Greece called with its light and ruins, and the way old stones hold stories without apology. Maria House sat while I wandered narrow streets, and Susan stayed over on certain nights so the house would feel occupied by friendship instead of fear. People asked whether I was afraid to travel alone at my age. I told them it was less frightening than discovering the war you must fight is inside your own family. On quiet evenings, I stood in my garden at 5 p.m. and watered the hydrangeas as if they were a promise I had made to a younger version of myself. That I would not stop tending beauty just because someone tried to plant rot. I learned to use a computer, my fingers awkward at first, then confident, like learning a new language that only asked for curiosity in return. The last pieces of the year settled into place like books returned to a shelf after a long, disordered search. Arthur finalized the protections we had erected around my estate and taught me to read certain documents with suspicion that did not harden into cynicism. Miller closed her file with a small smile. Told me I had done more than save my home. I had helped identify patterns that would protect other widows in our town. Emily called one evening at 7:30 p.m. from her small kitchen where the light from a single lamp made courage look like a domestic habit. She did not beg, she asked. Could we begin again with truth as the only decoration on the table? I said yes, not because the past had become lighter, but because I was strong enough to lift it without breaking myself. We met on Sundays for coffee the way we used to, and she told me, haltingly, when she had first known something was wrong and had chosen convenience over conscience. I told her about the slow art of rebuilding, how trust returns as a guest before it ever considers becoming a resident. Some evenings, Maria joined us, and sorrow did not mind the company. The children made drawings for my refrigerator door that looked like maps to better places. I found that the house no longer echoed the way it had when Richard died. It sounded like a place where a woman lives who has made choices that belong to her. On a clear morning, I booked another trip and left the itinerary on the counter, not as a warning to anyone, but as an offering to myself. I learned to enjoy being a person whose days are not arranged around someone else's comfort. I kept the recorder in a drawer, a relic of a war I had won without forfeiting my tenderness. When the garden bloomed, I invited Susan and Maria and Emily to sit on the wrought iron chairs Richard had bought for our 20th anniversary, and I did not hear betrayal in the metal. I heard endurance. We talked about grief and wire hangers and tax forms, about the ways love can return in different clothes, about the simple fact that I still used the white porcelain cup Richard had given me on our first anniversary. It is not sentimental to keep using a good cup. It is wise. That night, before sleep, I stood in the hallway mirror and met the gaze of a woman who no longer mistook quiet for weakness. Alone felt like a posture of strength rather than a punishment. I thought of every widow whose instincts are being argued with by people who benefit from her doubt, and I wanted to tell her this: you are not confused, you are being convinced. Hold on to what you know, then write it down. If this story moved you, tap. Like to help it reach more people. Share it with someone who needs courage. Subscribe for more true-to-life dramas of resilience, and comment the moment that hit you hardest. I read every one.